Before the Second Age. JRR Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings had its foundation in the book we now know as the Silmarillion, eventually published in 1977 under the masterful editorship of his son Christopher. It was a volume that drew together the whole matter of Middle-earth's creation and its passage from an age of myth to a time where stories merge into histories, inspired, as its author would say, by his basic passion for myth, not allegory, and for fairy story, and above all for heroic legend on the brink of fairy tale and history, of which there is far too little in the world accessible to me for my appetite. In 1951, long before the publication of the Silmarillion, with its tales of the first age of Middle-earth, and indeed before even The Lord of the Rings had reached the hands of a reading public, Tolkien wrote to his friend Milton Waldman about the scope of his ambition as a teller of tales. Do not laugh, but once upon a time, my crest has long since fallen. I had a mind to make a body of more or less connected legend, ranging from the large and cosmogonic to the level of romantic fairy story, the larger founded on the lesser in contact with the earth, the lesser drawing splendor from the vast backcloths, which I could dedicate simply to England, to my country. It should possess a tone and quality that I desired, somewhat cool and clear, be redolent of our air, the climate and soil of the Northwest, meaning Britain and the hither parts of Europe, not Italy or the Aegean, still less the East, and while possessing, if I could achieve it, the fair elusive beauty that some call Celtic, though it is rarely found in genuine ancient Celtic things, it should be high, purged of the gross, and fit for the more adult mind of a land long now steeped in poetry. I would draw some of the great tales in fullness, and leave many only placed in the scheme and sketched. The cycle should be linked to a majestic whole, and yet leave scope for other minds and hands, wielding paint and music and drama. Absurd. Ambitious, certainly, but fortunately for us, not as absurd as Tolkien imagined in his more frustrated and doubtful moments, and it was a concept to which he constantly returned and determinedly pursued, even though his mode of pursuit was that of a wandering traveler, picking up languages, making maps, and ever ready to leave the highway of his central narrative in order to explore picturesque or dangerous byways before returning to the road ahead, which explains, no doubt, why the idea of the road is one that runs, twisting and turning, through so much of his writing. Commenting on the grand imagined sweep of his absurd scheme, Tolkien readily admitted that it had neither been conceived nor developed all at once. Instead, it had come together in a way that speaks to the very specific impact that his writing was to have, and still has, on a readership that spans continents and cultures. The mere stories he wrote were the thing. They arose in my mind as given things, and as they came separately, so too the links grew. An absorbing, though continually interrupted labor, especially since, even apart from the necessities of life, the mind would wing to the other pole and spend itself on the linguistics. Yet always I had a sense of accord in what was already there, somewhere, not of inventing. Perhaps the power of all great literature lies in that audacious moment of suspended disbelief. Tolkien's reference to linguistics is itself key to that creative process, since his love and great knowledge of languages infuses the fictional with antiquity, as he wrote. Many children make up or begin to make up imaginary languages. I have been at it since I could write, but I have never stopped, and of course, as a professional philologist especially interested in linguistic aesthetics, I have changed in taste, improved in theory, and probably in craft. Behind my stories is now a nexus of languages, mostly only structurally sketched. But to those creatures which in English I call misleadingly elves are assigned two related languages, more nearly completed, whose history is written, and whose forms, representing two different sides of my own linguistic taste, are deduced scientifically from a common origin. Out of these languages are made nearly all the names that appear in my legends. This gives a certain character, a cohesion, a consistency of linguistic style, and an illusion of historicity to the nomenclature, or so I believe, that is markedly lacking in other comparable things. The foregoing comments were a preface to his attempt at providing an outline of the events recorded in his complex legendarium, and which take place in the long age preceding the one chronicled in the present volume. The cycles begin, he wrote, with a cosmogonical myth, the music of the Ainur. God and the Valar are revealed. These latter are, as we should say, angelic powers, whose function is to exercise delegated authority in their spheres. They are divine, that is, were originally outside and existed before the making of the world. Following the creation story, the narrative of the Silmarillion continues as Tolkien outlined in his letter. It moves then swiftly to the history of the elves, or the Silmarillion proper, to the world as we perceive it, but of course transfigured in a still half-mythical mode. That is, it deals with rational incarnate creatures of more or less comparable stature with our own. These are the firstborn, the elves, and the followers, men. The doom of the elves is to be immortal, to love the beauty of the world, to bring it to full flower with their gifts of delicacy and perfection, to last while it lasts, never leaving it even when slain, but returning. And yet, when the followers come, to teach them and make way for them, to fade as the followers grow and absorb the life from which both proceed. The doom or the gift of men is mortality, freedom from the circles of the world. As I say, the legendary Silmarillion is peculiar and differs from all similar things that I know. Its center of view and interest is not men, but elves. Men come in inevitably. After all, the author is a man, and if he has an audience, they will be men, and men must come into our tales as such, and not merely transfigured or partially represented as elves, dwarfs, hobbits, etc. But they remain peripheral, latecomers, and however growingly important, not principals. The main body of the tale, the Silmarillion proper, is about the fall of the most gifted kindred of the elves, their exile from Valinor, a kind of paradise, the home of the gods. In the furthest west, their re-entry into Middle-earth, the land of their birth but long under the rule of the enemy, and their strife with him, the power of evil still visibly incarnate. It receives its name because the events are all threaded upon the fate and significance of the Silmarilli, radiance of pure light, or primeval jewels. But the Silmarilli were more than just beautiful things as such. There was light, there was the light of Valinor made visible in the two trees of silver and gold. These were slain by the enemy out of malice, and Valinor was darkened, though from them, ere they died utterly, were derived the lights of sun and moon. A marked difference here between these legends and most others is that the sun is not a divine symbol but a second-best thing, and the light of the sun, the world under the sun, become terms for a fallen world and a dislocated, imperfect vision. But the chief artificer of the elves, Feanor, had imprisoned the light of Valinor in the three supreme jewels, the Silmarilli, before the trees were sullied or slain. This light thus lived thereafter only in these gems. The fall of the elves comes about through the possessive attitude of Feanor and his 7 sons to these gems. They are captured by the enemy set in his iron crown and guarded in his impenetrable stronghold. The sons of Feanor take a terrible and blasphemous oath of enmity and vengeance against all or any, even of the gods, who dares to claim any part or right in the Silmarilli. They pervert the greater part of their kindreds, who rebel against the gods, and depart from paradise, and go to make hopeless war upon the enemy. The first fruit of their fall is war in paradise, the slaying of elves by elves, and this and their evil oath dogs all their later heroism, generating treasuries and undoing all victories. The Silmarillion is the history of the war of the exiled elves against the enemy, which all takes place in the northwest of the world, Middle-earth. Several tales of victory and tragedy are caught up in it, but it ends with catastrophe and the passing of the ancient world, the world of the long First Age. The jewels are recovered by the final intervention of the gods, only to be lost forever to the elves, one in the sea, one in the deeps of earth, and one as a star of heaven. This legendarium ends with a vision of the end of the world, its breaking and remaking, and the recovery of the Silmarilla in the light before the sun. As the stories become less mythical and more like stories and romances, men are interwoven. For the most part, these are good men. Families and their chiefs who, rejecting the service of evil and hearing rumors of the gods of the west and the high elves, flee westward and come into contact with the exiled elves in the midst of their war. The men who appear are mainly those of the three houses of the fathers of men, whose chieftains become allies of the elf lords. The contact of men and elves already foreshadows the history of the later ages, and a recurrent theme is the idea that in men, as they now are, there is a strand of blood and inheritance derived from the elves, and that the art and poetry of men is largely dependent on it or modified by it. There are thus two marriages of mortal and elf, both later coalescing in the kindred of Eärendil, represented by Elrond the half-elven who appears in all the stories, even The Hobbit. The chief of the stories of the Silmarillion, and the one most fully treated, is the story of Beren and Luthien the Elf Maiden. Here we meet, among other things, the first example of the motive to become dominant in hobbits, that the great policies of world history, the wheels of the world, are often turned not by the lords and governors, even gods, but by the seemingly unknown and weak, owing to the secret life in creation and the part unknowable to all wisdom but one, that resides in the intrusions of the children of God into the drama. It is Beren, the outlawed mortal, who succeeds with the help of Luthien, a mere maiden even if an elf of royalty, where all the armies and warriors have failed. He penetrates the stronghold of the enemy and wrests one of the Silmarilli from the Iron Crown. Thus he wins the hand of Luthien, and the first marriage of mortal and immortal is achieved. As such, the story is, I think, a beautiful and powerful heroic fairy romance, receivable in itself, with only a very general vague knowledge of the background. But it is also a fundamental link in the cycle, deprived of its full significance out of its place therein. For the capture of the Silmaril, a supreme victory leads to disaster. The oath of the sons of Fëanor becomes operative, and lust for the Silmaril brings all the kingdoms of the elves to ruin. Nevertheless, it was from the union of Beren and Luthien to Nuviel that came from the line of the half-elven, later numbering not just Elrond, master of Rivendell, but also Elros, his twin brother and first king of Númenór, and in a further generation would be seen in the children from another marriage between man and elf in the persons of Aragorn and the Lady Arwen. Tolkien continued, "There are other stories almost equally full in treatment, and equally independent and yet linked to the general history. There is the Children of Húrin, the tragic tale of Turin Turambar and his sister Nineo, of which Turin is the hero. There is the fall of Gondolin, the chief elvish stronghold, and the tale, or tales, of Eärendil the Wanderer. He is important as the person who brings the Silmarillion to its end, and as providing in his offspring the main links to and persons in the tales of later ages. His function, as the representative of both kindreds, elves and men, is to find a sea passage back to the land of the gods, and as ambassador persuade them to take thought again for the exiles, to pity them and rescue them from the enemy. His wife Elwing descends from Luthien and still possesses the Silmaril. But the curse still works, and Eärendil's home is destroyed by the sons of Fëanor. But this provides the solution. Elwing, casting herself into the sea to save the jewel, comes to Eärendil, and with the power of the great gem, they pass at last to Valinor and accomplish their errand, at the cost of never being allowed to return or dwell again with elves or men. The gods then move again, and great power comes out of the west, and the stronghold of the enemy is destroyed, and he himself is thrust out of the world into the void, never to reappear there in incarnate form again. The remaining 2 Silmarils are regained from the Iron Crown only to be lost. The last 2 sons of Fëanor, compelled by their oath, steal them and are destroyed by them, casting themselves into the sea and the pits of the earth. The ship of Eärendil, adorned with the last Silmaril, is set in heaven as the brightest star. So ends the